In the previous lecture, we have studied about system calls, and in this lecture, we will be seeing the types of system calls. So system calls can be grouped roughly into 5 major categories. So we'll be seeing how can we group our system calls into these 5 categories, and we will be seeing what are the differences between these categories of system calls. So here we have the 5 categories of system calls. The first one is the process control, and second is the file manipulation, third is device management, fourth is information maintenance, and fifth is communications. So these are the 5 groups or 5 major categories of system calls, and all the system calls that we have, they can be roughly grouped into these 5 major categories. Now let us see what are the meanings of these 5 categories one by one, and we will see how they are different from each other. Alright, so let's start with the first one, which is process control. So by process control, what we mean is the system calls that are used for controlling the processes. So we know that there are various processes running in our system, and all these processes needs to be controlled. For example, when a process is running, it has to run and it has to terminate or halt either normally or abnormally. So by normally, what I mean is that the process should come to a halt when it completes its execution. Otherwise, there might also be errors occurring in that process. So if an error occurs in the execution of a process, then that process has to be halted or aborted. So that is what we mean by halting abnormally. So the system calls that are used for controlling the processes fall under this category of process control system calls. So here are some examples. We have end or abort. So by end, we mean that to end the process in a normal way when it completes its execution. And by abort, we mean to halt that process when it encounters an error. So that is what we mean by end and abort. Then we have the load and execute. So by load, we mean to load a process, and execute means to execute a process. Then we have create process and terminate process. So for creating a process or for terminating a process also, we need system calls, and they all fall under this category of process control system calls. Then we have get process attributes and set process attributes for getting and setting the attributes of our processes. Then we have wait for time. So this means that some of the processes, they needs to wait for their time to come so that they can begin their execution. So this will be clear when we study about the scheduling algorithms and all, which we will be discussing later on. So a process may need to wait for its time of execution. So for that also we need a system call. Then we have wait event or signal event. So a process may need to wait for an event or need to signal an event. Then we have the allocate and free memory. That means that when a process is going to be executed, it may need memory. It may need access to the memory. So we may have to allocate the memory for that process. And when the process finishes execution, that memory which was allocated to that process has to be freed. So that is what we mean by free memory. So these are all examples of system calls that are used for controlling the processes. So they all fall under the category of process control system calls. So that is the first one. Alright, so now let's go to the second one. So the second one is file manipulation or file management. So these are the system calls that are used for manipulating or managing your files. So for example, we have create file and delete file, that is used for creating and deleting files. Then we have open and close for opening files and closing files. Then we have read, write and reposition. Then we have get file attributes and set file attributes. So in the previous lecture, when we were discussing about system calls, I took an example to explain system calls. So that example was to copy the contents of an input file to an output file. So there what we did, we were searching for an input file, and then we read from that input file, and then we created an output file, and we were copying the contents from the input file and writing it onto the output file. So those system calls, they fall under this category of file manipulation. So we see in that previous example, we were creating the output file. So we use this create file, and then we open the input file. So for that we have used the open. Then we were reading the data from the input file. For that we can use this read, and then we were writing the data to the output file. For that we can use a write, and after everything was done, we closed the files. So for that we can use the close. So these are the examples of system calls that are used for file management or file manipulation, which falls under this category. Alright, so now let's go to the third one. So the third one is device manipulation. So device manipulation or device management are the group of system calls that are used for managing or manipulating your devices. So devices can mean your input-output devices or other devices that are there in your system. So for example, we have request device and release device. So a process may need access to a certain device. So at that time it will need to request device. So request device is a system call, and after that particular process finishes using the device, that device has to be released. So that is what we mean by release device. Then similarly we have the read, write and reposition, same as above. Then we also have the get device attributes and set device attributes for getting and setting the device attributes. Then we have logically attach or detach devices. So this means that these are the system calls used for logically attaching or detaching devices. Now, what is the meaning of logically attaching? Logically attaching is a little bit different from physically attaching. Physically attaching a device means you physically plug in a device into your system. So let me give you an example. So let's say that you have a pen drive or a flash drive. So physically attaching would mean that you plug it into your system manually. Now logically attaching means that the operating system needs to understand that the device has been attached and it is ready for use. So that is what we mean by logically attaching. And then logically detaching means you are logically removing that device from your system. So for example, in your pen drives, after you use your pen drives, you may right click on the icon of your pen drive and you may choose eject, or you may choose safely remove hardware. So when you do that, you see that the pen drive is removed from your system, though it is still physically plugged in. So that is an example of logically detaching the devices. So that is just a simple example. There could also be many other examples regarding this. So what we need to understand is that all the system calls that are used for managing or manipulating these devices, they fall under this device manipulation system calls. Alright, now let's go to the fourth one. So the fourth one is information maintenance. So by information maintenance, what we mean is that all the information that we have about our system must be maintained and must be updated. For example, the date and the time. So the system calls used for maintaining the information of your system, they fall under this category of information maintenance system calls. So here we have examples like get time or date and set time or date. So this means that we get the time or date and then we set the time or the date. Then we have get system data and set system data. So similarly, like the time and date, we can get and set the system data. Then we have get process, file or device attributes. So we can get the attributes of the processes, files or the devices. And then we have set process, file or device attributes. So we can get the attributes of the files, processes or devices, and we can set the attributes of the processes, files or devices. So all these kind of system calls that are related to maintaining the information of your system, they fall under this category of information maintenance system calls. Now let's go to the last one. So the last one is communications system calls. So communication system calls are those system calls which are used for communication between different processes or different devices. So as I already told you, the processes needs to communicate with each other. So when a process is executing, it may need to access another process. So they may need to communicate with each other, or they may need to know the status of each other. So in that way, there needs to be constant communication between the processes. So the system calls related to communications, they fall under this category. So for example, we have create or delete communication connection. So when two processes are going to communicate with each other, there needs to be a connection between them. So we need to create the connection, and after the communication is complete, we need to delete the connection. So for creating and deleting the communication connection, we need system calls, and this is an example of that. Then we have send or receive messages. So as the processes communicate to each other, they may need to send or receive messages from each other. So this is another example of that system call. Then we have transfer status information. That means when the processes communicate to each other, they may need to report the current status of that particular process. So a process may need to say that, yes, I have completed my execution, or it may have to say that I need access to this particular resource. So in that way, the process is transferring its status information. Then we have attached or detached remote devices. So there may be remote devices attached to the system, or which may have to be attached to the system. So for attaching those devices and for detaching those devices also, we need these communications, because these are remote devices, so communication is required to attach or detach them. So all these system calls that are related with communications, they fall under this category of communications system calls. Alright, so those were the major 5 categories of system calls that we have. So let's just have a recap of them: process control, file manipulation, device management, information maintenance, and communications. So these are the 5 major categories into which you can group your system calls. So I hope this was clear to you. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.